Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this research panel on market design and tariffication. My name is Christian. I'm a PhD student at the Graduate School of Economics, Finance, and Management in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. And I'm joined by my fellow researchers, Dumitrescu of TU Berlin, Hasan of Europa-UniversitätFlensburg, and Khanna of the Hertie School in Berlin. Each of us will present our ongoing research projects, starting with Raluca, shedding some light on prosumer empowerment agreements in Bangladesh, followed by Maminol's presentation on the dynamic electricity tariff for rebranding battery backup systems, also focusing on. Next in line will be Tarun's insight on optimizing agricultural demand response for reducing costs of renewable energy integration, primarily looking at data from the Indian state of Gujarat. And last but not least, I'll provide some first analytic pricing signals in peer-to-peer solar microgrids in Bangladesh. As chair of the session, I'd like to remind my fellow panelists to limit their presentations to about 15 minutes. Each presentation will be followed by a brief discussion session during which we're happy to field questions through the Q&A box. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Raluca.
Thank you so much, Christian, for the introduction. We, together with an interdisciplinary team, here Jens, Alexandra, and Sebastian, we are trying to calculate and establish a methodology for the first time in the energy access sector for a community power purchase agreement, which is some sort of hybrid or a deviation for the normal power purchase agreements, with an application for peer-to-peer swarm grids, which are then interconnected to the national grid. I think many of our speakers have already said very well, the speakers from the previous sessions have explained very well the circumstances in Bangladesh, but maybe just as a reminder to those who have just joined our session now, Bangladesh is the country which has the highest density of solar home systems in the world. And you can see just in this picture, there are numerous solar home systems which were installed through microfinancing program run by under the umbrella of ITCOL. We're talking about more than 58 local companies called partner organizations who offer a combination of loans plus the technical assistance needed for households, for small businesses to run such systems. And this is a bit how the microloan looks like, and why splitting or supporting the access to energy in combination with financial inclusion reaches a broader population. Now coming to our paper and to our topic. Currently, there are quite a lot of innovations happening in Bangladesh in the field of decentralized electrification. One of them is called swarm electrification, or peer-to-peer networks. This graph tries to show you a bit what are the steps. So household which has a solar home system can be interconnected with another household which has a solar home system, and gradually grow towards the national grid. If you have participated in the opening session of today's conference, one of the representative of MES Solshare, the company which currently is implementing in Bangladesh peer-to-peer networks, has explained that currently Solshare is running a regulatory sandbox through which this final step, this interconnection of clusters of households with the national grid happens. Well, here's just a snapshot of the topology of how such a peer-to-peer network looks like. And within such a network, we have both consumers and prosumers. Consumers are those who have already a solar home system or do not have any solar home system, but just acquire electricity for their own consumption, while prosumers are those who are also able to generate income by selling their surplus electricity. Here we see an example of the owner of a small a restaurant who, if you see here in the background, has this orange box, which is actually, let's say, the infrastructure, the hardware that allows him to be part of such a peer-to-peer grid. So as I was saying, currently, these peer-to-peer grids in Bangladesh are being tested, or the idea of interconnecting through a point of common coupling. Here, the interconnection with the national grid, which is definitely quite a technical endeavor, because on the one hand, we have here the solar home systems, which are in a DC world, DC infrastructure, also in terms of appliances. And then on the right side here, we have the national grid, which runs an AC infrastructure, which in the case of Bangladesh, maybe is not, let's say, the smartest grid. And on top of this infrastructure, the question comes on the type of unit economics and the type of financial agreement between a utility and this peer-to-peer grid between the decentralized cluster. And this is where we come in with our paper, where we're trying to calculate and to establish the fundamentals of such a tariff, of such a exchange, financial exchange between the national grid, the national utility, and the decentralized grid.
I'd just like to take over in terms of the modeling that we would like to do in this paper. And I have to say, we say here it's a concept note because we're still working on the details. So we want to discuss today just a little bit of what we are currently trying to do, but we can't present any numbers yet. So in terms of the CPPA that Raluca just introduced, we basically want to find out how high should this CPPA be? And that's like the very basic question that we're asking, but it's not that basic at all. It's actually quite complex. So in the first step, we actually want to think, or we are thinking about the influence factors that go into the CPPA tariff that we want to calculate. So basically, as a first step, look at, okay, what are the factors that might be influential to this tariff, and how we calculate it. And then as a second sub-step of this tariff design, we want to build kind of a simulation or a calculation, however you would like to call it, of the CPPA tariff, thinking of different market rules. So in the setup that Raluca has just shown, there are already different types of tariffs that the prosumers and consumers in the system can use. And we are thinking about comparable options of how the CPPA could be established. So either it could be a fixed number, so it's not dependent on any outside situation. So this is comparable to the EEG levy that we have in Germany. So regardless of the time of day or anything, you just always pay the same fixed amount on your used electricity. But there could also be variability in time of the CPPA, or as something in between the two, just a two tariff CPPA. So depending on how this could be done. And once we have established these influence factors on the tariff, we want to try out some sensitivities. So identifying additional sensitivities that the CPPA could have, for example, the renewables production, the network availability, but also things like the demand increase. So there is demand variability in the short term, but there is very likely a demand increase in the future. because obviously once you have a little bit of electricity available and you have your first appliances, then you do want more and you want to try to expand your system at home. And so your demand in the long term will also increase. So from there, we want to derive some models of how these sensitivities can then be tested. And we want to also do this possibly with stochastic methods, because obviously in these sensitivities, there are a lot of uncertainties covered. And this should also be a part of the models in the end. And once we've done this, from there, we want to derive basically policy options or policy recommendations of how these revenues that come in from the CPPA into the swarm, into this, you could call it also a virtual power plant here, how they are then broken down to the different entities, the different players in the swarm. That could be the prosumers, so the pure consumers, but also IPPs, so independent power producers, entities that are in the swarm, but that are actually just producing power from a solar system that can be used in the swarm, just as like is the case today already in some of these villages. So we want to identify what the differences between these tariffs can be, and then from there basically formulate recommendations for a tariff. And then next slide, please. So again, just about our approach. So first of all, what we are doing is collecting all the necessary data. So there's, for example, a lot of time series data that we need. So as I said, the demand, the excess production, so what's not already used within the households, the household demands, and the household productions. So these are like the aggregated and disaggregated numbers that we need here. And then one important question is, the costs of actually establishing this point of common coupling to the national grid and the inverter losses connected with this, because obviously there's this AC grid connected to the DC swarm grid. So there will be losses inherent in the system and somebody needs to pay for this. And then we can also think about the costs for the solar home systems, the IPP operation costs, costs of storage, current local prices, and so on. So we have to think about all these different influencing factors on the CPPA system. Then, as I said, as a next step, we want to basically estimate the CPPA. And in order to do so, we also need to think about how the system is actually run. So a couple of a set of rules, how the production, so the storage and the grid also are used in the system. And then we can do our proposed time-dependent calculations of the CPPA. And then in the last step, as we said, we need to find an allocation mechanism, how to allocate this income to the different participants in the swarm. And one important question here is a fair allocation. And there's a question mark behind this, because in order to do so, you need to define what fair actually is. So this is part of the policy that we are trying to come up with here, to also see what fair options are and what we can propose here. And then next slide, please. So as I said, there are a couple of different scenarios, you could say, that we need to test here in order to cover the sensitivities that we have. So as I said, renewable production, network availability, and demand increase could be 3 of those. And again, we can test these given the here proposed 3 different options of how the CPPA could be calculated. And the question is then, under the different scenarios, which of these tariff options would be, for example, most robust? So how could this then also work in the long term? And then next slide, I will just give back to you, Reluka, for the outlook.
Yeah, thank you, Jens. So in terms of the outlook, we also want to give a practical side to our research. As I've mentioned, most of the data collected work will come from the regulatory sandbox, so this testing of the interconnection between the swarm grid and the national grid. And currently, there is not a specific agreement, or it's kind of no man's land in terms of what should be the arrangement between the operator of a swarm grid and the national grid. So our role would be to come up with a solution for the private sector. In this case, it will be Solskjaer, to propose to them sustainable CPPA. At the same time, it is also a recommendation towards the public sector in terms of how additions can be or in terms of how a new policy can be added to the net metering policy, what sort of incentives, particularly in the case of Bangladesh, can be created to solve the question or the problem of what will happen with the millions of solar home systems already in the field, so many assets, as the grid advances, and it's already so advanced in Bangladesh. And then we will also try to come up with a viability gap financing framework, a sort of smart subsidy, if you may like to call it like that, in order to support the private sector to collaborate in the sort of community PPAs with the public sector. Of course, also for the private sector, a solution for a sustainable business model and operational model, and also a sort of a visionary way forward. What happens after once energy access is established? What is the next step? I think we are a bit above our 15 minutes, but
you're right on time.
Christian.
Well,
Yes.
well done. Thanks, Luca, for these very interesting insights. I would like to ask Mominul, I believe, to kick off the discussion.
Actually, what I wanted to present next presentation, you've already presented some of them.
Sorry, Mominul.
So I would like to compare. So, but it would be a good approach, good dynamics. Like you started from the bottom of the pyramid, and I will go to the grid section of the similar concept, grid connected part of the similar concept. I'm very happy that you showed the same picture. I remember from the Soul Grid, which actually I was a part of that as well. I can remember the picture, makes me nostalgic. So my question would be how, so you were also talking about virtual power plant, how you were thinking of including this concept in Soul Grid, virtual power plant. Definitely this whole concept is about virtual power plant, because if I can buy the energy from my neighbor, and I don't know who is the neighbor, but how it works.
Maybe let me start by answering that, and then Jens, also, if you want to complement my answer, maybe also explaining a bit in the energy communities here in Germany how that works. The idea is the following: in the peer-to-peer grid, in the Soul Grid, as you call it, or swarm grid, the houses are interconnected, right? So that means that also all the batteries are somehow interconnected, and they can act as a storage for the entire, for the national grid. And at the same time, they can also feed in when they have surplus electricity, but also draw electricity from the grid, in addition to many other services that can be provided for the grid. And if you just recall, I said that in Bangladesh, I think, I don't want to make a mistake, but the grid is not smart enough
this is what I can argue later in my presentation.
Exactly. So I'm just teasing your presentation. Yeah, because you're also coming with somehow from the same avenue, no? But yeah, you're looking, and you're also looking at what happens at the grid level, somehow grid and consumer connection. So actually that cluster of households, that swarm grid, acts somehow as a power plant. Meaning that the national grid also doesn't need to extend to go really to the last mile with the distribution, with the transmission, also to increase its generation. It can act upon the existing infrastructure and take advantage of that existing infrastructure. Jens, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think you basically already said everything. I think I'm not sure if I had mentioned this about the cost of, we talked about the cost of the point of common coupling, but there would, on the alternate way, there would also be the cost of extending the national grid to every house in the village. And you would also need to trade this cost off against just continuing to use the existing swarm, which would be way more useful. But as we said, as Rebecca had already mentioned, currently the national grid is kind of a danger to the system, because they are able to offer electricity way cheaper, but obviously not not at the same quality in terms of reliability, and also not clean. So it's very dirty electricity, but
oh no,
but it's cheap. So we need to find a way of how to integrate the two without kind of destroying the very important work of the decentralized supply here.
Maybe one last sentence. The fact that our paper is based on the Bangladeshi case, it's honestly, we're in heaven, because we have already all the infrastructure things are happening now in Bangladesh. I'm referring now also back to Shonali's presentation from the previous session, where she was discussing about MTF, whether the new version of the MTF. So the question is, what happens once you have energy access? Now, how do we reach, how do we go to that energy well-being and personal well-being, now what she was referring to. So now I'm thinking about Africa, right, where you also have millions of solar home systems, whether they are pay-as-you-go, microfinance, however, what will happen? How will that population grow on the energy ladder? So the fact that Bangladesh is so advanced and already going through this kind of question mark through this infrastructural change, we're just somehow, from a research perspective, we're kind of taking advantage and trying also to offer a solution for sub-Saharan Africa, and also for all those private sector companies who have millions of solar home systems already installed, and they also ask themselves, hey, what happens when the national grid comes? Will my customer dump my pay-as-you-go system? Or is there a solution of interconnecting from the technical perspective, but also of some sort of cash flow exchange of tariffing with the public utility? So that is a bit our vision.
We actually had an answer from the a question from the public on this. I see that Jens is typing an answer, but maybe Raluca, you want to pitch in. So Nicholas was asking what happens when the grid arrives, whether you will also look into grid stabilization effects when you link up your mini grids, whether that could contribute to tariff design, and if it's something you will look into.
Exactly. This is what we mean by servicing the grid. So this is one of the services that such a swarm grid can offer to the national grid. So it's not just feeding in the surplus electricity or drawing, but also stabilization services. And we're also looking into that and how to price such things, because honestly, currently we have no clue. But as we collect data and see how often these things happen, when they happen, it's also about what Jens was saying in terms of scenarios. Is it worth having a sort of day and night? Does this exchange of services happen daily? Does it happen somehow once a month? Does it happen in extraordinary climate conditions and impacts? Because we had in Bangladesh last year, right, a huge storm, which I think rendered more than 10 million people off grid, just because the national grid broke down. So in that circumstance, can a swarm grid, can a decentralized system offer resilience to the national grid? These are just questions we're looking into and hopefully analyzing through and offering some answers with our paper.
Thank you, Raluca. Thank you.
All right.
And I wish you a belated happy birthday, because a couple of days ago you had birthday.
Thank you, Momino. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, Momino, on this happy note, I would like to thank Raluca very much and Jens for their presentation, and I would hand over to you, please.
Yeah, so I would like to be a little bit alive here, so I can start my presentation without sharing my my slide. So before I start, I would like to tell you a story. Like when I was a teenager, which is the background of this research actually. When I was a teenager, it's back in 1997 or 2000, something like this. So we used to have a lot of scheduled and unscheduled blackout in our brownout actually in our system. So which led us in the evening to go outside again and to play again and meeting friends and doing some adventure in the evening when it was dark. And we didn't need to study because there was no light due to brownout, and there was no we didn't need to study. But the thing is, the happiness didn't sustain for a long time, like this kind of fun, because my father, brought he bought a strange device called IPS at that time, which stores energy from grid, operates as binary algorithm. If grid is there, it is charging. If grid is not there, it's discharging. It's a binary algorithm. So from this, this is the background of my research, how I came to this. And in 2006, I also ended up as a salesman of IPS in a company, in a well-renowned company. At that time, that company has vanished now. I was also a salesman of IPS, which is instant power supply. So this was the background of this non-halal topic. Here you can see, I share my screen now. So this is my research topic, quite broad, and I also call it a little bit non-halal because it has a non-halal part in my presentation. But there is an option. So what I want to achieve, my objective from this presentation is to show, is to uncover another opportunities in Bangladesh, similar as solar home system, to start energy transition in our country. So before I go to my presentation, main presentation, I would like to go for a poll, which I just how many energy systems from your perspective are there in 2 countries. So you can start voting, and I will answer this discussion on the way. And I will show you the result, how it looks like to you. So here you see most of them you answered really good, and I will discuss the result on the way to my throughout my presentation. So let's see how it comes. So I did a scrutiny about IPS in Bangladesh, but it was really hard to identify how many IPSs are in our country. But luckily, I found a study from SMAP about energy access diagnostic report. So they released it in 2019, and I found like every 1 household out of 5 households have IPS in Bangladesh. So, and this in urban area, and in rural area is 2%. So the capacity of this IPS. So if I sum up all these IPS in our country, it goes to 3 million systems. So as you answered, like most of you answered more than 1 million. So you are right. So it's more than 3 million at least, I think. And the aggregated capacity of this IPS battery capacity is more than 6 gigawatt hour. So I think it's a huge thing in our country, which is not uncovered yet, not by the policymaker, that how we can utilize this 6 gigawatt hour battery storages as a distributed energy storage on the way to energy transition. So so here is the concept of IPS is for unreliable grid, but there is an option. There is an option to transform this the backup system as a catalyst for energy transition. For example, if we just consider it behind the meter energy storage concept, which you know probably in Germany or in Europe, like what Tesla Powerwall is providing and Sonnen is providing. So we can actually adapt this system in our power system as behind the meter energy storage, which is BTM. Here is the concept of BTM. Main concept of BTM is like here battery backup, battery system communicates with the smart meter, and it charges and discharges as well as feeds in the grid when grid needs support. So it is bidirectional. On the contrary, in our Bangladeshi version of BTM or the IPS, it is somehow like we only have meter, and I already said it operates like a binary command. When the grid is active, it is charging. When grid is not there, it's discharging. So it's, I call it Einbahnstraße. So it is going only one way, no communication with the meter, no communication with other things. So this is where the BTM provide supports different to different entities. For example, customers, consumers of the electricity and the power system with the different supports. We are already, most of us already familiar with this kind of support, like increasing self-consumption for backup power and frequency regulation for the frequency and voltage regulation for the power system. But if we just transform like the IPS as BTM, what the two benefits we can immediately enjoy, that is energy time shift from the grid. Even though if we do not have solar right now, but still we have peak in the evening, we can reduce the energy in the evening currently. But if we have higher solar penetration in the grid, we can do that as well. Time shifting of solar energy and use it in the evening, as well as peak shaving. Not only from the user point of view, or also from the generator, from the supplier point of view. They don't need to switch on all the fossil fuel based power plant. What Raluca said, very dirty, or someone said, we don't need to turn on all the power plant in the evening. So it helps immediately if we just convert this IPS into BTM storage. So this is the new bottle for the old wine, what I propose. So we can retrofit, or we can make next generation IPS, which is next generation grid interactive green IPS. We can name it like Tesla and Jonen, and then we can rebrand it to the customer. So how it can operate? I mean, if we just adopt the typical concept of BTM energy storage, we can put solar system on the rooftop of the people who have this IPS and help them increasing self-consumption. And this is what we can do. But there are practical aspects we need to consider, which is, this is Dhaka, this is the building. The building heights are very heterogeneous. We are not only growing horizontally, we are also growing vertically. So the rooftop on the rooftop will not be sufficient to meet all the energy demands of this building. So we need to think beyond this rooftop system and rooftop system somehow, and also how to include this IPS in the system. So this is why this is my second proposal. How we can do that? We can have rooftop system. In addition, what we can do, we can think of distant solar system, which could be large rooftop and ground mounted system, and we tap the energy through the grid and the distribution network and to our system at home. So, but there is we need somehow the mechanism to bridge the gap. What could be the bridging gap? So one thing is smart meter, which already have started in Bangladesh. Raluca, you cannot just criticize in Bangladesh. So we already have 3 million solar 3 million meters, smart prepaid meters, and I checked the meter data. It can be controlled dynamically. From the operator point of view. Even in Flensburg, I do not have a smart meter, but my home in Bangladesh received smart meter. And this is the main motivation, another main motivation to go for this kind of research. But still something is missing. We need dynamic pricing to buy energy from distant solar systems, or even from neighbors as well. So could be TOU, time of use energy, which already we have, but presently it may not sufficient because we might need more segments in TOU. We have only peak and off-peak, but we might need super off-peak or other segments, solar peak or something like this in this. Or we can go for real-time pricing as well as seasonal. Seasonal means if all the irrigation systems are not working, then we can even buy energy cheaper from this irrigation system to the at household. And we can also go for PPA, what Microsoft or other companies are going to do, like these people are buying solar energy or renewable energy from somewhere else with a PPA contract. We can also apply that. We can also play with these incentive tools. There should be other incentives, what we provide, policy incentives or some financial incentives to both the entity. So here is my research plan. I would say like this is an ongoing research. Your opinion and feedback would be very valuable for me. I am planning to do like a status quo in Bangladesh for IPS market trend. How many solar IPS is still being sold and what are the current characteristics, capacities. I will determine the status quo for residential energy consumption and the rooftop area as well. Also the investment capacity, investment willingness. And I will also analyze 5 scenarios, which I will just jump in the next slide, you will see, and discuss the pathway for wider application. So required policies and also global application, how we can take this experience to other countries. So scenario 1 here, users with green IPS, what I just said, like rebranding concept, green IPS, it is the individual customers who does not have rooftop, but still they want to use solar systems somewhere else. So this is one method. I will analyze this scenario only as a single user. And the second scenario could be IPS owner together with solar system on rooftop, how they to increase the self-consumption. And the third scenario is the green IPS with the shared PV system. For example, I have a big rooftop, my neighbor will share, similar as sole share concept. But here the main idea is to reduce the distance, to reduce the transmission loss, as well as increase the energy usage locally. So I will emphasize energy consumption from local sources. So to reduce distance cost of energy. So in that case, real-time pricing and TOU can also be used. And the third scenario is a new dimension called, I call it the energy cooperative and virtual solar system. For example, we have many housing systems in our housing societies in Bangladesh. So these housing societies actually can purchase energy from solar power plant distant. And as an investor, as a single person, I do not have the capacity to invest in megawatt peak power plant. But I will be very, very proud to have 1 kilowatt peak share in that megawatt peak power plant. I can invest that. So I would mobilize my intention to mobilize the citizen to invest in this kind of power plant. So to come to this kind of, to come to play. So here in this case, we have a new player. You can see the TSO, we need to deal with the transmission service operator. So cost will be a little bit higher. The fifth scenario is especially for front of the meter. So we have behind the meter, and then we could talk about front of the meter. This meter will be grid interactive. This energy storage will be grid interactive, as well as provide services for solar generation locally. So local problem locally solved, kind of this kind of thing. So in that case, people can also earn money by providing services for solar, for handling the variability of solar locally from local distributors. So these are the scenarios I would like to analyze in my research. And here is the discussion. What I want to say, like as you said already, in Germany it's 500,000. Yes, it is 500,000. It's nearly 200,000 so far. We can see that, and the main motivation what I want to see is show here is in Germany, the protection against power failure is not important. It's important hedging energy and contribution to energy vending. But in Bangladesh, without this kind of motivation, the power failure reason only brought 3 million people to buy IPS. So there could be more motivation. So without direct financial benefit. So here my conclusion, Christian, you are eyeing on me, I know. So we already have the culture in our country to have battery backup system. So this is not difficult to promote this behind the meter energy storage. Good progress in digitalization in power systems, as you saw the digital meter as well as digital systems in power systems, which are really satisfactory. I do not have data, so many data from other different countries. What I can gather from Bangladesh right now sitting here, it is not possible from other countries. many of other countries, in developing countries especially. So where success factor in solar home system, we can take the financing mechanisms from solar home system program to this program, this kind of program as well. And we are actually battery nation. We have lots of batteries in our countries, batteries in solar home systems, batteries in IPS, and batteries in solar electric rickshaw. So we do not need to think about the storage problem in our country. We just need to think smartly how we use existing storage for making a smart energy system. Just smart thinking we need. And we also have potential, we are also graduating from LDCs, which gives a good signal. We can integrate citizen RE investment program to invest. So instead of looking for big companies or big investors, as I said, I would be personally very happy to invest in 1 kilowatt of the megawatt power plant. So this is how we can do the financial, we can collect finance for this kind of program. I thank you. This was my presentation, and I would be happy to answer the questions if you have.
Yeah. So this is Tarun's call to kick off the discussion. Tarun, please.
Let me.
Thanks, Mominul. That was a super interesting presentation. When I read your abstract, firstly, I completely understood your story growing up in Delhi. I understand the context that you're coming from and the need by people to install these systems in the first place. And I read your abstract. I thought it was very interesting. It's something that's definitely been talked about in the Indian context as well. When regulators are discussing regulation for batteries and battery services in India, the central regulator actually discussed this possibility as well. So it's for me, it's your work, of course, is more at a conceptual stage right now, but I'm very curious where it evolves. It definitely has applications beyond Bangladesh. My questions are, I think, two. Maybe this just helps in thinking more about this. So, and the first one is exactly where you left off. The really reason why people buy these systems is to ensure reliability of supply. And there, I feel there might be a bit of this conflict with the solar charging motivation. For example, suppose to make it effective as a renewable energy integration tool, what you want to do is that get people to charge only during the peak sun hours and discharge at night. Let's take an example when there's a power cut at midnight, from midnight to 2 a.m. and the battery gets discharged. Now, in this scenario, we would ideally want people to not recharge immediately when the power comes back at 2 a.m., but rather wait till 10 a.m. in the morning and then recharge their batteries. But then that's in direct contradiction with their reliability of supply goal, which is what if there's another power cut at 8 a.m.? That means they have no supply left. So that's what I see as something that has to be worked around in understanding how these systems can be utilized. So just having a time of use tariff, which incentivizes charging during the day, might not be sufficient if the reliability is not somehow secured as well. Right? So that's the thing that came to my mind as you were talking. And I don't know what the solution is, but I think that could be that definitely is something that needs to be thought about. The second point that I thought was very interesting is your differentiation with different kinds of households, and some which have a solar rooftop already on board, some which don't. And again, I think that's an interesting classification. To me, I think the most interesting houses are the ones which probably don't have solar rooftops already, because the ones that do, again, yes, you can somehow get them to charge during the day, but they will probably in any case be using this energy. Like you said, the rooftops in these countries are not big enough to supply the entire house needs in any
Exactly.
So the solar rooftop is just a minor, or will always be a marginal part of the overall urban household supply. In rural areas, it might be different. So I think the more interesting case is one when you don't have a solar rooftop, but you do have this battery backup system, and then you need to somehow make it grid interactive so that it can provide both integration services to the grid and then possibly other services like frequency services, etc. And then I think the business case needs, I think the analysis is super important, and that's really the first step about what is really the potential of getting these batteries on board and their ability to provide these system services. And I think it can be quite substantial, like you mentioned, it's about 6 gigawatt hour of storage capacity that's lying around essentially. But then I think the next step would be a sort of and maybe this is not really a part of your research, but would be what is the business case to get households to invest in these smart meters or a better quality of IPS, which can do this interaction with the grid, because I'm not sure if grid services are priced in the Bangladesh electricity grid or not, because then one of your recommendations from this research would be at the same time, grid services need to be priced, because unless grid services are priced, the distribution company has no incentive to use these batteries for providing grid services at all, because they don't have to incur any cost. So that's the other problem. That's a discussion which the central regulator in India had, where it was like, but what is the business case? Like, why would distribution companies pay these batteries?
We need to give Mominul a minute to react to all your
there are many points there. I would like to add two things to be very straightforward. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. So technology is already there, because I saw many presentations. So the question you said, what will happen if we have a blackout at the 2 a.m. if it is not discharged? I just saw a presentation yesterday or today in the HEM, Solar Works maybe, or some other company. They already have this kind of algorithms in their system. So we do not need to invent something. We can integrate. Instead of inventing, we can integrate those technologies into our IPS. So this is one thing. Another thing is definitely we need to incentivize the DSO, distributed operator, and also TSO if we talk about distance solar. So we currently are paying like distribution cost is 0.81 Bangladeshi paisa, like 0.81 taka, less than 1 taka in Bangladesh per kilowatt hour, as well as 0.23 taka for transmission cost in Bangladesh. So these are the challenge, and on top we need to add the battery wiring costs, energy cycling costs through the battery. So these are the challenge we need to handle. So in Bangladesh, as you said, like Bangladesh, there's one challenge right now. What should we consider? We should consider grid parity or socket parity. We have two types of socket parity. We need to consider two types of socket parity in Bangladesh. We already achieved grid parity from wholesale price point of view. We already have socket price with the retail price, average retail price, but we have not achieved socket price for subsidized electricity price. So this is still a way to go. We need to, these are the challenges for making dynamic pricing. How we integrate wider context in this kind of system. Thank you. I would like to discuss. If you have any question, you can send me email.
Mominul, maybe connecting to the dynamic pricing. So someone was asking about the how we best leverage those 3 million smart meters that are already there. Maybe just one quick thought on that from you.
Yeah, I don't know what was the government perspective of distributing a smart prepaid meter is to reduce energy bill collection cost. So, but I don't think they thought about smart energy, how much they thought about smart energy systems. But I read the specification of this meter. This meter, as I said already, this meter can be used in smart energy systems. This meter has the ability to react in dynamic pricing, as a seasonal pricing, as well as TOU. So these definitely with the innovation concept I presented here, or any other innovation concept from Bangladesh government, can be integrated with this kind of with this 3 million, and more smart meters are coming into the grid. So definitely this is a great opportunity for us. I think it is just a smart thinking away. It's not smart systems are there, smart thinking. I mean, how we use this system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot for the start, Maminul. And yeah, then now it's Tarun's turn, please.
We'll be moving not very far from Bangladesh, but into India and to the western part of India for this presentation, where I try and understand, again, another means of using existing infrastructure to reduce the costs of renewable energy integration, which I hope will also resonate with our participants, at least from Bangladesh. So what I want to talk about is that fact that agricultural pumping load is actually a significant part of the overall electricity consumption in several of the big Indian states. This is it. So, for example, in the state of Gujarat, it accounts for nearly 20% of the overall electricity consumption. Traditionally, this has been a very difficult part or problematic part of the supply, partly because it tends to be highly subsidized or essentially free electricity given to farmers, which means that both the electricity companies and the state governments make some sort of loss on this supply. It has also been linked to overutilization of groundwater and leading to lowering of water table in parts of the country. The solution to this problem has been to create a system of segregated feeders for irrigation supply in rural areas. Essentially, what they enable you to do is to limit the amount of supply for agriculture pumping while you can continue to supply to households and businesses in rural India. This allows the governments to limit the amount of electricity supply and also the amount of water then that is consequently used by farmers. This system has been created under great expense using World Bank loans at many occasions and is widely prevalent in at least 10 of the Indian states. However, the system can also be or is already being used as a form of demand side management resource and can be used further to integrate, to facilitate grid integration of renewables. At least that's what I argue in this paper. The analysis, as I mentioned, is in the western part of the country for the state of Gujarat. The basic research question that I started out with was, what is the economic value of agricultural demand management to the electricity grid? And what is the potential of this agricultural demand management in facilitating RE integration in India in the future? The way I do this analysis is by building a short-run cost optimization model. Essentially, what this model does is map all the generation power plants in the state from where the state buys its supply and all the demand centers for the power. And then it tries to match the demand and supply for each hour of the year while trying to minimize the operational costs of the entire system. So technically, it is called as the unit commitment model, but it's essentially just in terms of economics, a short-run cost optimization model. Before we get into sort of the modeling piece, just to give you a bit overview about Gujarat and how things stand there. So most of Gujarat is heavily reliant on coal for electricity generation. 80% of the demand is met through coal-based generation capacity. It is, however, one of the primary leading states in renewable energy development in the country. So currently about 13% of the electricity supply comes from VRE. I call it VRE because it's variable renewable energy, so wind and solar. But it plans to actually scale this up dramatically in the next decade to about 40 to 50% of the supply. Gujarat is one of the only states in the country which has categorically, as a policy statement, said that it will not build any more coal power plants in the future. So which is all great, and this is great news for carbon emissions, but it creates serious challenges for grid management. On this screen, you see how does the increasing shares of VRE affect the electricity system in Gujarat. So you can see that two things are very clear. First of all, the system still remains coal. The maximum capacity is still coal dominated, but this coal capacity now has to work in tandem with the renewables, which means that it has to provide energy when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And this can happen at very fast intervals, which means that this number of times the coal plants have to start and stop, and the way they have to increase and decrease their output increases dramatically. Coal plants are not designed to do this, which means that this imposes a cost on the coal plant. Their performance goes down, and this adds an additional operational cost to the entire system. And we see that as the share of VRE or renewables in the grid increases to 40 or 50%, these costs increase substantially from what they are right now. The other problem, which comes, is that the capacity factors at which these plants operate also falls. Capacity factors simply being the percentage of time that the plant is actually generating electricity based on compared to its actual capacity. This decreases again, obviously, as VRE becomes more dominant, but problematically, again, this imposes the per unit cost of energy increases because the fixed costs of generation in the PPA, which are already written down in the PPA, will not be waived off. So electricity utilities are paying more for getting less energy from these plants. And the last part is, because of the imbalances, because wind blows at the same time and sun shines at the same time for all panels and plants, there are massive problems in terms of VRE curtailment, which are not very significant till up to at least 20 to 25% of VRE. But as the VRE sharing crosses 30%, these start becoming problematic quite quickly. So the solution that I wanted to discuss was, how do you use load management of the agricultural load, which I mentioned already is provided separately, to facilitate this. One big problem was that there is no data available on these things. However, I went into sort of collecting hourly load schedules for supply in rural Gujarat to understand how this supply is structured. So the important thing to, I think, notice is that electricity supply to farmers is not on demand, but is rather restricted to 8 hours a day, and the utility decides when it will supply and how much load. So that's the kind of schedule which you see on the screen, and it is published every week for every region of Gujarat. What I did was I collected all these schedules for a year and aggregated them to understand what is the actual demand supply curve to agriculture in the current system. And you can see very clearly from the graph on the left that the supply essentially is concentrated at night, and there's a minimal supply during the evening hours when peak demand from households tends to already exert on the system. So essentially, Gujarat farmers get the supply when it's the cheapest to provide them electricity supply. At any point, just to give you a sense of the scale of this demand side management, the total connected load of irrigation in Gujarat is 11,500 megawatts. At any point in time, farmers do not get more than 4,500 megawatts of electricity. So only about a third of the load is supplied at any given point in time. So that's a massive amount of demand management going on. What does this mean in terms of its current system? So I created this sort of hypothetical curve of what would happen if all these farmers were to actually start irrigating their fields during the day instead of night. So like how you expect normal human beings to work, like go out and do their work during the day. And that's in this gray curve over here. If that were the case, then operational cost of the Gujarat system would increase by up to 6%. And that's the cost of the entire system, which is substantial. But more importantly, that the impact on coal power plants will be even higher. So the number of times that the units have to start and stop, and the total ramping requirements of the entire system would increase substantially. So essentially, the current system allows the the distribution companies and the grid planners to really supply electricity to farmers such that the coal power plants can work beautifully at a constant pace of output throughout the day, and they don't have to exert too much pressure on managing other forms of demand or the power grid as such. However, this will not continue as the amount of VRE in the system increases. The current supply schedules and the current way in which the demand is managed is no longer sustainable. What I tried to find out was how would it evolve as the amount of wind and solar increases. So there are sort of two distinct scenarios for two distinct seasons of the year. I look at one case where this sort of increase in renewables is driven by wind or the way it is right now. In that scenario, I find that essentially the supply schedules don't change, or the way you manage this agriculture demand doesn't change much, except during the monsoon months. But if the drive into renewables has to be driven by solar, then this would have to change substantially, meaning that you'll have to shift a lot more of the agriculture supply to daytime hours compared to what is being done right now. That would be the most optimal thing to do. And that yields some good benefits. For example, if you consider the major metrics that we discussed in terms of managing your existing efficiency of the existing coal power plants, the number of unit starts and the ramping requirements decreases significantly. This also improves the system efficiency of the power plant in general, which means that they also are less polluting at the same time. The other big advantage is that VRE curtailment, or the amount of wind and solar energy that you're not using, decreases substantially. This is again due to the peak shifting, that really nice curve that Mominul showed in his presentation. While I don't have it, would equally apply in this scenario, where you're essentially shifting the demand to meet the solar supply during the day or the wind supply during the nighttime hours. Decreasing the VRE curtailment significantly from up to 14% to 6% in case of solar, and from 10% to about 4% for wind. Enabling higher absorption of VRE in the system naturally has benefits on reducing carbon emissions. So the overall impact on carbon emissions is estimated to be around 8% reduction in carbon emissions from just this shift. It also really impacts the economics of renewable. And okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna sort of maybe skip this slide just for now. But if you have questions, I'll come back to it. But it sort of improves the economics on the market viability of renewables is the basic point. I'm going to quickly touch upon the decentralized versus decentralized approaches. So there are two ways of sort of managing this agricultural demand. One is the way it is being done right now, where you physically limit it through the system. But increasingly, what's becoming clear in India is that a good alternative could be to just give farmers solar panels and provide solar irrigation pumps instead. And that makes it really, it's good for the farmers, and it's also good for the grid, but depends on how you do it. So if you do it in this way, which I call the option 2, which is solar pumps to run on solar power only, you essentially force the farmers or give them incentives to run their power pumps using the solar supply, and they do not tap into the grid for additional supply, but they do have the choice of providing additional energy that they generate if they don't want to use it back into the grid. That has benefits because essentially what we saw earlier was that there are you have to maintain an 8-hour continuous supply, which means that you still can't really tap into the peak solar generation a lot of times, and the peak shifting that occurs is not complete. With solarization of agricultural pumps, you can completely tap into this agricultural demand and really utilize, because the output of the pumps just varies with the solar supply, which is not detrimental to the farmers as such, and it enables absorption of all this energy instead of feeding it to the grid at the time when the grid doesn't need it. If you do this in this sort of decentralized approach,
maybe a final thought.
These are my final slides. So this decentralized approach increases the benefits both in terms of grid operations and BRE curtailment. As a last slide, just to mention the limits of this approach, there are some costs. First of all, if you don't provide farmers an incentive to provide, to limit their electricity use, again, this will lead to groundwater utilization. And this can be solved by providing the right tariff to provide electricity to the grid from these solar panels. But again, there has to be some sort of a time of use feed-in tariff, which harks back to the first presentation that we saw today, where this feed-in, which goes from these decentralized system, has to be timed. At least that, I believe, would be a better solution, and provides a reason why, even in that case, maybe it's a better solution. Apart from that, I think that would be an important point of discussion with this approach. And I would like to end here.
Great, thanks a lot, Tarun, for these additional insights, and yeah, from a huge farming community. Since we're talking about tariffication in this panel, I was wondering, I mean, I think we've all seen the protests of farmers in India. I know that's more centered around Delhi, but I think the discussion is going in Gujarat as well. Given the legal changes that are being discussed, do you think, you know, the additional cost would have to be shouldered entirely by the system? Could the farmers even afford to switch to more solar options?
So the current scheme, which is being launched in India, already provides for 30% subsidy for farmers to shift them to solar agricultural pumps. But the mechanics of the scheme it's still very much in pilot mode, so it's on a very small scale yet, and that's why I think the research is sort of timely to look at it. So the mode in which this would be scaled up is not being decided yet. So it's clear that governments have an incentive to do this because it limits their overall subsidy output, but the exact mechanic scheme is not being discussed. And I think what I say is you should do it one way and not the others, because there are grid implications of how you do this.
Okay, and I was wondering, so I don't think anybody likes working in the middle of the night. Do you have evidence on the ground that people are already sort of on their own using solar energy to run them decentralizedly, like you mentioned?
Okay, so there are two things. There are people who have already deployed solar systems, but that's mostly in cases where grid supply does not reach. You have to understand that people are happy to work at night because this electricity is essentially for free. So there's a big incentive to use it whenever it gets supplied.
We have a clarification question. Given that there has been separation of the feeder, why is there a night peak in the demand curve, slide 9?
So it's the slide 9 is not the demand curve, but rather the supply curve of electricity to farmers. So like I said, the supply is managed. We don't know what the actual demand from farmers is because it's not available. Thanks, Ayushi. But so this curve is actually a supply curve. So most of the power is supplied to them at night.
Great. Okay. Let me see. Oh yeah, I was wondering about this very demand curve. How many hours of electricity supply would actually be optimal? Because I understand irrigating during the day, you have evaporation and stuff, so there might be benefits of providing the energy at night. But I guess 8 hours is kind of short, right? Doesn't the ground dry up too much?
Actually, 8 hours is already pretty generous. In other states in India, their amount of supply is shorter. But as a policy target, the government of India has set 8 hour supply, 8 to 12 hours of supply as a policy goal for irrigation.
And what do the farmers think? Wouldn't they like more energy during the day and would like more spread out?
All right. So the idea, definitely there's a demand from the farming community to shift this to daytime hours. Absolutely. That's been well documented.
Okay. I want to talk about a pilot that we're running on analytics on pricing signals and peer-to-peer solar microgrids in Bangladesh. My co-authors are Sebastian of BRAC University in Bangladesh, Annette, who's been with Tokyo University for a long time, and Sony Computer Science Labs, Eshrat with SoulShare, whom we've heard a lot about, the company. And yeah, so just to give you a bit of a background, SoulShare provides microgrids to link up SHS in rural Bangladesh mostly. They currently have 49 grids they cater to. So we have 396 households benefiting. Half of those are roughly prosumers, so those who feed energy or have the opportunity to feed energy into the system, but also benefit, like all the other consumers, from receiving energy. We have around 8.5 kilowatt hours used daily across all those grids, so it's quite sizable by now. And people invest around 35 Bangladeshi taka, so that's around 45 US dollars, cents per month to top up their soul boxes to purchase energy. So what we are wondering about is prices are set non-dynamically. The previous speakers have all raised that you know, time of use should actually play a role in feed-in tariffs, and also, of course, in the prices that people pay. So right now we have flat prices focusing on cost recovery for prosumers, and focusing for consumers how much they would pay otherwise for kerosene or alternative sources of energy. But of course, it would be better if we could vary this a bit more. So what does the literature say? Of course, we all know there are recognized benefits of electrification. It's a goal in itself. 7 that solar microgrids, even in higher tiered energy use, can be sort of the solution, has also been documented by now. Lee, Miguel, and Wolfram have run a very big experiment in undergrid Kenya. Big outcome there is, of course, the pricing is key in connecting. They are wondering why people use so little energy in undergrid Kenya. There's many issues like reliability of energy provision, which is less of a problem in the solar grids that we're looking at, and the number of appliances that people have. That trading prices currently do not vary dynamically in solar mini grids has also been documented, and this is something that we now want to shed some more light onto. So what do we want to look at? Of course, gains for households and small firms by varying prices. Of course, we can put a price tag on these gains apart from you know, more anecdotal evidence. And of course, people benefit in many different ways. There might be more mean electricity consumption than when you have to purchase kerosene. We have reduced volatility of electricity supply. This is especially important in the areas that the grid, the national grid in Bangladesh is currently reaching, like we are in the first presentation. And of course, we want to find out which pricing rules maximize trading volume and value creation, especially for prosumers, but also consumers. So what are our objectives in our pricing analysis? We want to find out on the extensive margin how much prosumers willing to pay to get linked up to the system, for the battery capacity that they need to invest into, and of course, what are they willing to pay to receive energy, and how much do they need to be paid for individual energy feed-ins into the grid to make sense for them. Then, of course, like I said, we want to try to gains from decentralized trade, so electricity volatility. We have data on all of that coming in from the grids. And of course, at the same time, we have a lot of SMEs as consumers or also prosumers in the system that have on their income, operating hours, you know, how do they reallocate, etc. Price sensitivities for off-grid customers. So we have grids in char areas, grids that are so far that it's going to take a while to reach them. So what happens, for instance, in our experiment, if we go below the national grid pricing per kilowatt hours, how does that impact demand? And of course, we midterm want to look into energy exchange logics that would optimize the trade on the spot. So we have one sell-side intervention, so we're paying people more to feed into the tariff, and of course we want to see what that does to the energy supplied by those prosumers, whether there are more prosumers on the extensive margin who want to link up to the grid. We want to see how many instances of potential sales. So when they had the capacity in their batteries, when did they actually sell, when it was possible? And of course, we also want to see if for some technical reason it didn't work, so if they complain. On the buy side, so when people can purchase power much more cheaply, we want to see, of course, if energy bought increased, which demographics increased their purchases, by how much. Same thing where there are technical issues, purchase load issues that prevented them from expanding their purchases and their demand. And of course, we want to also see if they maybe increase the hours per day that they used their energy. So our experiment is very simple at this time. Like I said, we're just piloting it at this point. So we want to increase the price paid to prosumers for feeding energy into the system by a factor of 5. So they would receive per kilowatt hour 50 Bangladeshi takas, which is around $5, $5.50. And people in the buy grids, where we vary the buy price, only would pay a third of the national grid rate. This is important, the national grid rate as a reference, because some of these buy grids have already been reached by the national grid, and some will be reached shortly. The whole experiment runs for 28 days. So how do we implement this? So all the customers in those grids where we vary the prices for sell or buying energy were phoned up and told about this promotional offer for 1 month. Then that variation got implemented on February 1st, actually. Via software, we changed the price paid to consumers, or that they had to pay to access electricity. And we're currently phoning up all the households again to know more about the experience, to see whether they experience any problems, to ask more about motivations for why they did or did not feed more into the system. And of course, in the end, we'll analyze the data we have from those surveys and also from the soul boxes on the ground, how much people fed into the system. Just to look at the population that we have, so we're doing this on a very small scale. It's just 7 grids. 2 of them receive the sell price variation, where you get 5 times the money into the system. 2 get a buy price, where you only pay a third of the national grid price, and we have 3 controls that we can touch sort of as a control. We have quite a number of players, so you can say one player is a household or a business. We have low percentages of females in those samples. It's quite a normal feature in Bangladesh. And as we can already see, the prosumers have more appliances than consumers who do not sell to the grid. So this might be interesting to see how they act differently. The micro-utilities that are mentioned here are backup capacity provided by software, because the prosumers at this point do not cover all the needs of the. As I said, we run the system for 28 days. We can access our data quarter-hourly. Even though we're currently looking at daily data, mostly data quality is an issue. So currently we receive 60% of the data, which we can still work on and draw lessons from. And we have data reaching back quite a bit to compare as well. Just to return to my initial point, so people keep putting money into their soul boxes to access energy across all of socialist grids. We see peaks around the harvesting season, and we see that even due to during the Corona lockdowns, interest has not sapped dramatically, which is good news. This is from historic data from one of the grids where we vary the sell price. So when people feed into the grid, we can see that the prosumers, that's the gray line on the bottom, only cover a very small part of the energy cost. So we were hoping to really ramp this up by offering them more money to see whether this is the issue. Unfortunately, at least the data that we've had so far from February 1st to 23rd, we can see that even though the energy purchase did increase, so just to remind you, we didn't change the buy price here, just the sell price. So the energy purchase did increase. However, the amount provided by the prosumers actually decreased quite a bit. And as we can see, in only 8% of the instances when they could have sold to the system having enough battery power, they did so. So this is definitely something we need to find out more about. That being said, there are issues with the data quality, and there are other issues that we have passive trading regime. So that might be a reason why these prosumers were so hesitant. And I also noted here that we have only 3 of 16 prosumers, like 98% of energy. So the question would be why, despite of the higher price, 13 of them decided to still not feed that much into the grid. This is how it looks for these 23 days in February. So we have a peak around the middle of the month, but for the rest of the time, people decided not to feed too much into the system compared to previous averages. Then we have the other grid where we made purchasing energy much more cheap. So we can see a spike in purchased energy that was last year around harvesting time, and also when energy credits, so people could purchase energy more cheaply as well. What happened here? So we can see compared to February last year, we had a huge spike in additional demand. So apparently making energy cheaper did have a positive impact. People had more interest, and we can see that the consumers drastically increased their share of energy they purchased. We also see this grid only, unfortunately, features one prosumer, that this prosumer fed into the grid nothing at this point, and also decreased his purchases of energy. So the story here is we can see graphically that making the buy price for energy cheaper really did the job for pushing up demand. So some preliminary conclusions. We're still looking into the hourly data, socioeconomic data, etc. But so our sell intervention did unfortunately apparently not incentivize prosumers to sell more. During the post survey that we're currently conducting, we will ask why they did not sell more, whether there were technical issues. We'll also try to find out whether more people were interested in linking up their solar home systems when they did hear about the higher prices. And yeah, like I said, we need to dive more into the reasons for why sales are so flat. By intervention, on the other hand, purchases did increase by a lot. It's mostly the consumers. We'll try to divvy that up further to see which demographics, was it businesses, individual people, maybe the number of appliances they had in their household played a role in how much they increased their purchases. All these questions we still need to answer. And of course, we still want to know whether they would have liked increases by even more, were there technical load issues. And of course, we still want to find out whether usage at night during the day where it increased. All right. This is already it from my end. I would like to hand over to Raluca to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Christian, so much. Thank you for your presentation. And we did a very interesting loop here now with our first presentation in this session, and now with this one. I would have two questions for you. The first one, are you considering also, so I noted in your abstract that you're running, let's say, 3 experiments. Are you also considering about a sort of seasonal tariffing? Because as you have shown in some of your slides, there were some peaks during a high harvest season, and we know that also determines the income generation within the households. So would this be interesting also for your experiment to say, okay, maybe during the harvesting season, we implement some sort of hybrid model with I don't know, discount to sellers or to buyers, depending on also what are the interests of the grid operator, or okay, in this case, sole share. So that would be one question. And the second question, I would want to maybe move or bring this discussion in the global north, because as also Momino has mentioned in his presentation, yeah, we have Tesla, we have Sonnen, who have batteries, and also virtually they try to interconnect, but also physically the batteries, and also try to push much more the topic of prosumage in the global north. The question is, do you think that your methodology, your dynamic pricing would also apply in the circumstances of the global north, or would the intervention or the methodology will be completely different?
Okay, coming back to your first question, maybe let me open up this nice slide about how the throughout the year, how things vary. We would like, of course, like I said, this is the pilot. The midterm goal is, of course, to see what would happen also with daily variations in the price. So night hour interest, what would happen if we make energy less costly in off-peak hours, or what would happen if we offer people more money feeding in during peak demand hours. So these are definitely very interesting questions. And of course, around the harvest season, when people have more money, what would happen if we make energy, more expensive or slightly cheaper during the rest of the year? So we really have to play around more with these incentivizations. That's definitely on the cards. We're just trying to get some very first insights here, and hopefully we'll learn more from also disaggregating the historic data a bit further. Regarding the global north, that's a very good question. I think, yeah, people are very used to having high levels of energy. I mean, the Energiewende, as positive a story as it is in Germany, has been somewhat slow because unfortunately people in the global north are still more focused on security rather than environmental issues, in my perception at least. And I do think it's extremely important, like you say, to also think about dynamic pricing in the global north. I think you absolutely have a point there. And activating battery storage, like Mominul pointed out, right, in the global north, when it comes to battery storage, that needs to be part of the solution if we have variable renewable energies. I think we're still lagging behind and can actually learn. So.
Correct. And I mean, we've seen what happened in Texas recently, right? With the complete failure of the centralized infrastructure and a complete lack of resilience to climate change at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It seems we are right on time, unless we have any further questions, which does not seem to be the case. All right.
Can I ask a quick question, Christian?
Absolutely, Taryn.
In the graph that you just showed, there seems to be a sort of spike in energy sold also by prosumers in October. Do you know why that is?
Sorry, let me share that again. Just come back to here. Yeah, so I mean, the prosumers, so at this point, this huge spike is also due to the energy credits that I mentioned. So Solskjaer already made it cheaper for people to buy energy around this time. And like I said, I think the differentiation prosumer-consumer shouldn't be too strict, because prosumers are often just households or small businesses that happen to have a panel on their houses. So in a way, many of the rules that govern everyone's purchasing behavior also count for them. So we can just have a farmer who happens to have a system, and therefore after harvest he's also.
Right. So the reason, and what's the reason for the spike in general in October then?
So the spike in general, like I said, is the harvesting season, but also here the extreme spike, especially compared to the same period around 2019, is that Solskjaer was able to let people purchase energy more cheaply. So normally when you charge 100 taka onto your meter, you only get 100 taka. And in this case, during this time, they could offer 600 takas for the 100 taka paid into it. So that obviously gave people more leeway to consume, and consume they did.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Great. All right. Then thank you so much to everyone. I think we've learned a lot here, and yeah, I look forward to the rest of the conference.